So, welcome to another one of our conversations. I'm really delighted that this particular session is with one of our own SIMNI members, Bettina Nissen, who lives here at Deception Bay as well. And she is a storyteller. And I'm really excited because she's been working away over the last few years. And Bettina's had a lot to do with the story of Deception Bay as well and how it's evolved over the last few decades, I might add. So Bettina, I'd love you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you actually got involved in being a storyteller, and how stories, through the sharing of that information, can actually make a difference for people who have some forms of mental health issues or for people who are supporting others with mental health issues.
Okay, thanks, Chris. How did I get to be a storyteller? Well, there's lots of answers to that question. I think I'm come from a family of 5 girls, 2 above and 2 below, a middle child, always the negotiator. So I think I learnt to tell stories from a very young age. But I also think that, of course, everyone is a storyteller. It just depends on how you use those stories in the world. So I was very lucky. I listened to my grandmother, who told me many, many stories when I was small. She told them to all of us, but I was the one who sat there. And a lot of her stories she did tell us folk and fairy tales, but she also told us stories about where the family came from. So our heritage from Ireland, but also who lived in Charters Towers and when they left there, who lived in Toowoomba, what parts of the family. She actually drew a whole map through story of our family and who we were descended from. Because if you know where you come from, then it's so much easier to know where you can go. And I think that's a lot about what story does. Our story tells us who we are and where we come from. And it can also give us the opportunity to tell us where we can go. We can actually fashion that story and make it move in the direction we want. So as a storyteller, I was also a children's librarian. I retired a little while ago now, not long. And I think I became an actual storyteller in that I moved from telling personal stories and telling the stories of my family into working with story. And I did that through being a librarian and a new children's librarian. And I was very lucky in the early days when I was first working in Mackay in the early 80s to put the book aside, to actually find that when you're working with a group of 35 toddlers, that in fact to sit them and focus on a book is a myth. Anyone who's got small children will know that. 35 toddlers, even 35 12-year-olds, let alone 35 14-year-olds, will not sit still for that amount of time. It's an enormous ask. Now, there are some things they'll sit still for. They'll sit still for folk and fairy tales. And the reason that they do that is that those stories are really, really old. And the stories that are those folk and fairy tales, they are actually about all the issues that people face every day in their life. So that's issues like the need for money, feeling abandoned, feeling lost, feeling unloved, not knowing what to do with your life. That's what folk and fairy tales are about. And that is the same in many different cultures. Now, some cultures, the emphasis will be more on explaining the landscape and the way the landscape works, but it's always us as the main characters in relationship with that land and with our home and with our family and with our world. So folk and fairy tales are about where we sit in the world. There's probably a lot of people out there that are thinking, hang on a sec, what's the Disney version of Cinderella got to do with anything? Well, of course, one thing you realise as a storyteller is that many of those stories, like the Disney versions of the Grimm fairy tales, are completely changed since the days that they were actually oral stories. And that's the other important point I'd like to make. The stories that I tell mouth to ear. And that's a really big difference, because the power of the spoken story is that we make the visuals ourselves inside our head. So there's not a filmmaker, there's not an illustrator, there's not an artist. There is not anyone else who's making those visuals. We hear the words and we make the visuals. Of course, we do have shared visuals. So a lot of kids will have the vision of Shrek of an ogre as Shrek, because they've all seen the movie. But the way it's put together is unique to each individual. All those differences will be coming together to make that story unique for that person at that time. So from telling folk and fairy tales in libraries, I found that even though I'm a librarian, of course, books are an important part of it, I would put the book aside and I told. And as soon as I did that, it completely changed the interactions, because telling stories is a dynamic interaction. It's something that happens between the listener and the teller. In some ways it's a performance, but far more than the performance, it's about the relationship between the audience, the listeners, and the teller. And so of course, if you're telling in a really big venue to a lot of people, it is a performance. But the best telling, even if it's in a classroom of 50 children, is not a performance. It's a way in which you connect with each and every one of those children, knowing that the whole time when you're telling something that's old and ancient, that they will be making these visuals and they'll be contextualizing those visuals and making them relevant to their own life. Now, as the teller, I can't have any control over what that child was doing or what that person was doing until they sat in front of me. All I've got is an artifact, an old folk tale. They'll come and they sit down, and what happened at their breakfast table, what happened at the night before, what happened with their grandma, what happened with their pet, all of those things are completely unknown to me. And so in order for everyone who's gathered to be able to meet in the same place with all our different life experiences, recent and past, is up to the storyteller to create what we call the story space. And the story space is a time outside present time. So it's sort of like going into a meditation. And those words that, from a Western European cultural point of view, that start stories like in a village far, far away or once upon a time, is actually shifting people from current time into story space. And in the story space, everything is negotiable. Everything can change. Everything is up for whatever's going to happen. So because I can't know that there might be a child or there might be an adult sitting there who's got post-traumatic stress disorder, or who's had whose car ran off the road on the way to work, and you don't know any of those things. So to be able to find people a safe space to come from their different and sometimes fractured world, it's up to us to create a safe space. And in that space, to use that time to tell, I do, an ancient story, an old folk tale. Now, of course, I tell from a Western European tradition because that's my cultural heritage. And it's important for storytellers to not take the cultural material of another culture. And so that's why I tell mostly from a Western European. Now, I do tell some African stories, and I tell some stories from Asia as well. And that's because those stories are in the public domain and usually well known. But if I think there's a culture like Australian Indigenous culture, it's not up to me to tell those stories, and particularly if there's a culture that's particularly at threat and has had lots of their material stolen in the past. So get everyone in the story space, tell them an old story, let the story do the work that the story has always done, and that's that story picks up and listens to what are the issues that are happening in that community at the moment, weaves it into a story that's metaphorical and feeds it back. And then everyone in the audience takes from the story what they most need to hear. So not everyone will take the same thing. So even though many people think storytelling is a teaching tool, it's very important that it's not that it's still got the flexibility. And that's also the beauty of old stories. They've got the flexibility for someone to take one thing from them and someone to take something else. I've sat with children and told them a story, and at the end I'll say something like, so what did you think that the giant looked like? And every child will have a different idea, because their vision of a giant is their unique vision. And what they've taken from that story will be what they take. So that's sort of the craft of a storyteller, to actually ensure that you deliver an old story that has integrity, that you deliver it within a contemporary context, and that you deliver it so that it has, each audience member has the opportunity to use that story and to take from it what they need. Fortunately, it's a very old craft, and people have been doing it for thousands of years, since people can talk, since language was the gift that humans got that others didn't. That is how old stories are, and we use it to explain the things that happen in our life. Yeah, so that's my short version.
That's fantastic. I think what I really gain from that as a takeaway is that everything is negotiable.
Yes, absolutely.
That even though people have heard different stories before, you know, and they think they might know the end of it, when you're actually weaving that story around your own life circumstances and that of your family, it doesn't necessarily mean that the same thing has to happen in the end. And I think for a lot of people that struggle with mental health issues or are supporting people in their circle that are suffering from that, it is about having that hope and exploring with them, you know, what could be different, what is something that, you know, they may aspire to doing that they don't necessarily feel at this point in time that they could actually reach. But I love that, and I think imagination is amazing. And when I was young, you know, I loved to read stories, and working as a disability support worker, I had a beautiful young child that loved having stories read to her. And I know my little inner child and her would run off to the faraway tree, have lots of adventures together. And I'd never read those stories before. So, you know, at the precious age of 58, as I was then, that was a bit of a long time, you know, coming to hear those sort of stories. But it's very powerful. And I think the other thing that I gained out of what you're talking about there is for people to listen really hard, listen with that, you know, an open heart, an open mind, not trying to jump ahead of someone who is trying to share and articulate their story and talk about the things that are really significant to them.
One of the things I discovered really quickly, Chris, when I began telling, when I sort of left libraries and started to tell in schools, because that's where I was mainly got my work in the early years, is what's called story begets story begets story. So what happens is that everyone will hear that story and it will be doing the work. And what would happen is that I'd go then to the staff room at lunchtime, and the teachers would start to tell me their story, because the distance between the metaphorical folktale and the actual life events is not far at all. And so people would be listening to a story, people would be listening to a story, well, like Undalatry, which is an African story, which is about a boy who is an orphan boy and how he calls up the power in a tree and to work with him, to be his ally. And that would just reflect, and people would respond to that. And so by the time it was lunchtime, people would start to tell me their stories. And I was so amazed by that. So it wasn't just children, it was adults as well, that I then went and did another postgraduate diploma, well, first and in counselling, because I just felt that I needed to have more skills. I also did some art therapy work and some psychodramatic training as well. And then I went and did a graduate diploma in social sciences counselling at QUT. And what was interesting about that is that I learnt what I wanted to use and what I didn't want to use. I became confident with what had emerged as a storyteller. And I always say I'm very pleased I was a storyteller before I became a counsellor because it was the integrity of the story that I believed in. And what I learnt was more skills to make that shift from the metaphor into the real life events and what to do with those real life events as they unfolded in a situation. I always found that I worked mostly in groups. I didn't do individual counselling. It's just not my thing. So after that, I very quickly started to get a lot of work using storytelling as a therapeutic method, particularly with women and children survivors of violence, but also with children that have been abused, with groups like the neonatal death. Once people found out about it, it was like, oh, wow, this is amazing. This is a creative method in which we can address issues and we can go not too deep. We don't have to go too deep at all. If there's deep work to be done, then that can be taken on by a therapist in a more intense situation. What this will do is within the story space, contained within the story space, we can then open up some doorways. And as you said it before, think about different ways for the story to unfold. So many people think, oh, those stories, you know, they've all got the same ending and that same ending is happily ever after. Well, in fact, that wasn't the ending of a lot of those stories when they were oral stories before the Grimm brothers or any of those people wrote them down, and particularly before Disney changed them and turned them into the sort of tales that he tells. Not that I mean, I still think they fit a role, but stories did not end happily ever after. These were stories that were created in the community for the community to find, or the village to find, a way of resolving an issue in that community. And not all things can be happily ever after. And the storytellers knew that, as did the community. It was a way of finding a different way for the story to unfold. And it's that different way for the story to unfold that is a resolution or a solution, not necessarily a solution, a resolution to the story that is satisfying to the listener. And that is the most important thing. So it's not about happily ever after. So many stories never were happily ever after. But the hope is that you can come up with a different way for that story to unfold yourself. Or you can come up with a different way for that story to unfold within your family unit or your setting or your relationship, or you find a different way. It doesn't mean that the story is going to necessarily be happily ever after. That is actually about having a vision of the future that you can aim for, that's different from the story that you're trapped in currently. And so it has that opportunity to, it has the opportunity for all those different endings to happen and for us to change the way, the ending of our own story. When you look at stories, you think that there are three essential elements in the story, and one is the character, and the character is always a reflection of ourselves. The other is the setting, and the setting is the circumstances of our life or the context in our life. And then there's the problem, because that's the way a story works. A story is about resolving issues and problems. If you tell a story which is, there's a difference between stories and anecdotes. Anecdotes don't necessarily have a problem. They might be about the fish, even if it's the fish who got away. It's still the problem that the fish got away. But there's a difference between that, between those things. So with those elements of story and the opportunity to renegotiate the story and to find a different way for you to be in one of the different characters, standing in different points of view in the story, it just opens up the opportunity to see things in a different way. And through seeing things in a different way, you can then come up with creative solutions or resolutions to what situation you're in. Yeah. I can't hear you, Chris. I've lost your...
There we go. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think that's really a very powerful message around Deception Bay being a safe place.
Yes.
And I've lived here for over 30 years, and I know you have as well, for quite a long time. And Deception Bay hasn't always enjoyed the best of reputations. And some of that's come from people that have never really got to know who the locals are. And it has been a very changing, dynamic community. And a big part of our message with our cyberbullying project that we did last year with the Kairos community, what we're doing this year with the Mental Health and Sexual Violence Prevention Week and activities too, is that we want this to be a very safe community for everybody. And it's when we start talking and sharing those stories about why we feel safe here, how we've got friends and feel a part of a community, that's really very empowering for everyone. Bettina, I'd love to invite you back again for another session on storytelling. And maybe what we'll do in the next series is actually have you tell a story, so that we can be here and be a part of all of that. So thank you so much for being a part of our SIMNI club, but also being able to just open our minds up a little bit more to the power of storytelling and the power of listening, and also, you know, just taking on board that we learn so much from each other when we create that safe space and give people the capacity to be able to share whatever is happening. And I love the fact that when you talk about different cultural heritages that people come from and some of the stories that they might have been told when they were young, or, you know, growing up, or what's significant to them, it's just amazing, because it can take you right to where they were when they were first learning these stories, both the good, the sad, and everything in between. But it's that beautiful connection with their soul and their spirit and their culture, and we're all the richer in Australia for having such a beautiful, diverse and multicultural community to learn from. Yeah, so thank you, Bettina. That was really great. And I'll look forward to the next story in our little link. And we just need to put a wrap on it here for the moment.
Yeah.
And yeah, it will be great.
Okay.
So thank you, Bettina.
Yeah.